Okay, so Colin's going to give us a summary of our round table from yesterday, and then I'll pitch in at the end to let you know what Alex TLC is our next steps are. Okay.
So apologies for delaying everyone. Just very quickly to thank Karen and Sarah in particular for putting together this amazing program. They held a newborn screening workshop yesterday to talk principally to American scientists and doctors who've been pioneering work with newborn screening. It was one of the best meetings that I think I've held on the topic ever, and there've been many over about a decade of being interested in it. And so Sarah's asked me to present a sort of summary of where we're at with newborn screening and how things have been going. These were the attendees at the meeting. I should say this is taken from Sarah's minutes, and if anybody ever needs minutes doing incredibly urgently, she's an absolute genius at them. She presented me with an amazingly polished set of minutes about 2 hours after the conference had ended. I've never seen anything like it. So thank you, Sarah. You can see that it was attended by, in particular, I'm going to flag up Anne Moser, because newborn screening has really only occurred because of the pioneering ideas of her sadly deceased husband, Hugo, and then Anne's amazing work in the laboratory from the early 2000s onwards. There are also a whole number of colleagues from the Kennedy Krieger Institute that she works with. Elisa Seeger from ALD Alliance, who's played a pivotal role in development of newborn screening in the USA. And colleagues from here in Europe, James Davison talked about the recent National Screening Committee review of ALD that I'll talk about later. Wolfgang Kohler will be known to many of you as an expert on adrenomyeloneuropathy, of course. Andrew ran the ALD service with me at Bristol Children's Hospital. Florian Eichler runs a gene therapy program. Leila Corns did quite a lot of pioneering work the best part of a decade ago on newborn screening here in Bristol as well. And we also had an attendee from Genomics England because they're interested in how this disease will be detected in the future. So a very wide-ranging and expert panel. So if we could just think for a moment why it is that
Sorry, Colin. Sorry to interrupt. That was me interrupting you. We can't see your slides. Can you share your screen? Perfect. Thank you.
So if we think about why we would want newborn screening, this is a slightly amended list that Anne Moser showed to us yesterday. Essentially, we would want to do pre-symptomatic diagnosis of males, so diagnosis of ALD at birth or very shortly after birth. And the main reasons we'd want to do that are to prevent adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease, whatever you want to call it, coming on without anybody knowing about it, particularly in response to the stress of an illness, where of course it can be lethal if it's not being detected quickly. We'd very particularly also want to improve diagnosis of cerebral ALD so that having identified which males were at risk for getting cerebral ALD, we would then do routine MRI scans, probably from about 2 years of age every 6 months, until about 10 years of age, and then probably decrease to annual scans thereafter. And if any sign of deterioration was shown on that, then we could proceed to either a transplant, hemopoietic stem cell transplants, that might be a bone marrow transplant or a cord blood transplant or a peripheral blood stem cell transplant, whatever way it's decided is best to get the cells from the donor, or gene therapy if that's available. But of course, there are many therapies, as you've been hearing about this morning, that are being developed that may be successful and therefore available for use in the future. And usually, if we can identify people early, we'll get the maximum bang for our buck from those treatments. We'll get the most effective therapy by starting them early. we would also be able to identify probably at least 95% of female carriers, opening the way up to family counselling, to wider identification of affected but unrecognised males with adrenoleukodystrophy, and also be then able to future manage adult onset adrenomyeloneuropathy very soon after it starts to become apparent. But also there'd be a small number of really very rare diseases that we'd pick up, which are called peroxisome biogenesis disorders. And if we identify those early as well, effectively by accident as a spin-off from looking for ALD, then that would also save those families from going through many unnecessary investigations, which are often very wide-ranging, expensive, and so on, making early diagnosis. And if supportive care is available for those disorders, then that would be helpful. So newborn screening was actually first proposed by Hugo Moser in 2004, but it was technically very challenging. So it was only in 2013 that actually the first pilot project began in Maryland, looking at 5,000 newborns. Then Elisa Seeger played a pivotal role. She decided to dedicate herself, I think at the anniversary of her son Aidan's death, to developing or trying to compel the US government and healthcare agencies that adrenoleukodystrophy would be added to their recommended uniform screening panel for disorders, which you'll often hear us refer to as the RUSP. And she was successful in that. That became enshrined in law as Aidan's Law, and then soon after was instituted, and now is actually being performed in 23 US states, and others are due to join shortly. And the hope is that actually all states will be being screened by about 2025. Now, she shared some statistics with us yesterday that already over 2 million newborns have been screened in the states from which she's able to get reliable data. Not all states, intriguingly, will share that data. And already they've identified 223 males, 202 female carriers, which is thought to be more than 95% of all of the babies that could be female carriers, as well as, incidentally, 58 children with Zellweger syndrome and 15 others with peroxisomal biogenesis disorders. So really stunning pickup. I think if you do the numbers or do the math, as I suppose they'd say, that sounds like to me it's about 1 in 10,000 people that have been screened have been found to be either males with ALD or female carriers. And that's something, I don't know, perhaps we could touch on in questions and discussion later. So what's the state with things in the UK? Well, the Newborn Screening Committee oversees newborn screening here. The diseases that are currently screened for are listed there. You can see that sickle cell disease is very common at 1 in every 270 newborns. But the diseases down the bottom are extremely rare. So where it says medium A cell CoA dehydrogenase deficiency, maple syrup urine disease, etc., etc. These are very rare diseases at a frequency of about 1 in 100 to 150,000. The expected frequency of ALD from most studies is somewhere between 1 in 16,000 and 1 in 21,000 newborns. So some of these diseases that are currently being screened for are vastly rarer than adrenoleukodystrophy. So a reason for not screening for it is not too low a frequency compared to things like sickle cell disease. We next need to turn to ethics. And I used to think that ethics were a matter that was clear-cut. Something was either ethical or it wasn't ethical. But as I've become older, I think I've become wiser. And you realize that every country, every state, every committee has its own ethical parameters. So the Newborn Screening Committee here, as James Davison was pointing out to us yesterday, believe that really important tenets of what they do are that the screening shouldn't cause harm, that you should only find the disease that you're looking for, and that you should only find something that you can do something about, so something for which there is a treatment. Now, this is a problem because if we do indiscriminate screening of all newborns, we'd obviously identify most female carriers and all males with adrenoleukodystrophy, even though in the first 10 years of life, from some statistics that were being presented to us from the Netherlands yesterday by Stefan Kemp, just 1 in 2 males with the disease will develop adrenal failure, and 1 in 3 will develop cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. And those are not new statistics. I mean, we've known for a long time that only about 30 or 40% of affected young males will develop the cerebral form of the disease. But nevertheless, what this means is that around half the boys that will be identified by this newborn screening would not require treatment at all in the first decade of life. And that's something which the newborn screening committee essentially won't tolerate as things stand at the moment. But I said that things aren't as clear-cut as you might imagine. So we have to remember that at present in the United States, provided that parental consent is given, all males and females are screened. So ethics is definitely more of a floating decimal point than an absolute, and it's influenced by many factors. And I've put a few in a list there: cultural factors, religious factors, political, economic factors. Of course, these are very expensive techniques we're talking about, so that invariably impacts on people's thinking. And also the experiences of particular diseases or things within families that committee members have gone through. And then, of course, there are external constraints that are imposed in an either seeing or unseeing way on the committee and its members. So it's really very complicated, and that's the only way that I can justify how one country can seemingly, multicultural countries, say like the USA, which is very reflective perhaps of our own culture, can come to a completely separate decision on what is ethical or unethical. So where have we been, and where's ALD Life, Alex TLC been with trying to get newborn screening implemented in this country, something that Anne Moser and her husband tried to inspire myself and Phil Jardine, one of my colleagues, to do about a decade ago when they came to Bristol to see us. Well, we were formally invited, or Alex TLC were formally invited by the Newborn Screening Committee to act as a pilot for their new application process in 2016. And a huge amount of work from the SCIO unit at Sheffield University went into that, to look at how effective the whole thing could be, what were the health economic implications, and that was all organised and I think funded through Bluebird Bio and Alex TLC. So we had a big evidence base, we thought, when we put in our application, but sadly that application was turned down. So why was it turned down? Well, I'm quoting as accurately as I can from the documents of the NSC. So there were significant gaps in the evidence base. And here's some examples. The screening test at the time was experimental and subject to evaluation still in the New York State screening program. That was undoubtedly true. It would identify boys with a genetic mutation who would not go on to develop cerebral ALD. Well, I've talked about that. That applies to 2/3 of all those that we would detect. That it would identify infants with conditions other than adrenoleukodystrophy, like Zellweger syndrome, for which there were no interventions. Again, not contestable, really. But irritatingly to me, having spent 25 years by that stage transplanting people with this disease at Bristol Children's Hospital, there was also uncertainty about the balance of long-term effects and harms of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. Well, that's something that we thought was a case we'd proven in the middle 1990s in a massive international study. And then another study that Hugo published in Lancet Neurology after that. We didn't really think that that was up for debate, but it is in the eyes of our newborn screening committee. There's a plan that routinely diseases that have applied previously are asked to reapply for consideration again every 2 or 3 years. And so we were invited to reapply at the start of the year and rapidly tried to put together an improved document, giving even more specific examples of how this disease had harmed our entire community, and ways in which we thought things could improve, and also majoring in part on adrenal failure and the importance of picking that up. And so we hoped we'd made a very good case, but sadly, we were bounced again. And this is the reasons that we were given on this occasion, which are similar, but not entirely the same as the ones last time around. So no study reported the incidence of ALD in the UK. That's true. We didn't think that was necessary. We figured we got a very analogous situation to the United States, and that therefore, why was it ever worthwhile pursuing the same sorts of studies that had already been published there? So we haven't done that. They said that the published newborn screening studies from the United States don't tell us the proportion of people with a mutation who will go on and develop symptoms, or the age of onset, and the clinical prognosis of the different types of ALD. Well, that's true. I mean, these need to be ongoing studies, and it's only in 10 or 20 years that we'll really know the answer to some of those questions. And we don't think newborn screening should wait until such studies are available. One of the things I did want to mention was that as regards incidence, in the UK, there's only been one really good study done, which was by the British Paediatric Surveillance Unit between 1997 and 2014. And that found that in the UK, the lifetime risk of developing adrenoleukodystrophy was 5.7 per million live births. So not far off, only 1 in 200,000 children. So seemingly 1/10 of the frequency that's been seen in international studies. We think that study was fundamentally flawed and wrong, and that most cases had been missed. But unfortunately, it is a sort of chain that hangs around our neck and stops us progressing in the UK as we think we should. There's limited evidence on factors that can predict the future phenotype of ALD. This is what are often referred to as biomarker studies. This is true. That the specific screening tests in the different US states and the different published studies differ in their sensitivity and specificity, and therefore in things like numbers of false positives. This is also true, although this is definitely being standardized progressively. And that, and I'm quoting here directly from their document, no studies directly compared the effectiveness of treatments for individuals identified pre-symptomatically with those presenting with clinical symptoms. Again, that is a study that I think realistically has to be prospective. It would take 10 to 20 years to do that study. And it's an incredibly high barrier to set to implementing newborn screening. So what next? Well, we'll be invited to reapply in 2024-25. There are glimmers of light, we think, on the horizon. So the NHS England has developed an inherited white matter service, and there will be a patient registry allied to that, starting to collect data from next April. So we should then have much more accurate UK incidence data, and I'm sure that will straight away start to show the failings of that old BPSU study. There's increasing standardization of the methods used in the US already, and information sharing is being actively encouraged by ALD Alliance. Better longitudinal disease studies are already being reported, such as the recent publication of one telling us about the Dutch experience. And biomarker studies are improving, such as measurement of neurofilament light, hoping that we'll be able to early predict the development of either cerebral disease or of spinal disease, and even response to its treatment. And then, as you know, also new treatments are being explored for adrenomyeloneuropathy. So there are really lots of areas that hopefully we'll be able to incorporate into that next application. But I just wanted to kind of really sign off with one thing that might be the way forward that we were hearing a lot about yesterday from Stefan Kemp from Amsterdam. And he was reporting a Dutch study which has been running this year, which has so far analysed 60,000 newborn blood spots. Now, like our newborn screening committee, the Dutch Health Council will only allow early diagnosis where this is shown to be directly beneficial to the neonate, thereby excluding females and also those with these other fringe findings, such as Zellweger syndrome. What they have is a 4-step process. The first of them is a crude one, which identifies quite a lot of people who are suspicious for either being carriers or affected males. But they then go on to a second X-counter step. Now, all of you, sadly, from COVID are now experts in PCR tests. And this is a type of PCR test that looks at the ratio of your normal chromosomes to your sex chromosomes and allows distinction between females and males. And so that step allows them to knock out of the analysis all females. They then do another more accurate biochemical step, and then finally follow that up for any that remain suspicious by actually sequencing the ABCD1 gene. Now, one of the problems, and actually they found it straight away in their work, is that you often come up with things called variants of unknown significance, i.e. a mutation that has not previously been reported in someone with ALD. And what they like to do then is to actually take a skin sample, grow the cells in the laboratory, and prove beyond any reasonable doubt that there's adrenoleukodystrophy present. So that's how they deal with that. It seems to us that that may be a way forward, that we could potentially plan to adopt the Dutch system and move forward with that in any future application that we make. Before I finish, I promised Sarah that I'd mention 2 studies. So Alex at TLC are constantly thinking of new areas that need to be covered to try to plug holes in our dam wall in our next application, and to broaden our understanding of the impact of this disease on everyone affected by it. And so they've already commissioned a study which is starting by Sheffield Hallamshire University to look at the psychosocial impact of a diagnosis of cerebral ALD on families and carers. And they're also planning a feasibility study to gauge the viewpoint of adult males with diagnosis of ALD or AMN on the potential impact that they think a newborn screening diagnosis would have had to someone like them were it to be approvable in the future. So major areas involvement, and I'd like to thank Karen, Sarah, and everybody who's worked with us on developing newborn screening applications and the background studies like the SHARE unit for the phenomenal amount of work and care and desire to really change and improve medicine as it affects this disease. I think it's a stunning amount of work, and I'm deeply grateful for everything that everyone's done so far. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Colin. I just wanted to reiterate that we are doing all we can to plug those gaps in the evidence base that the National Screening Committee want from us, and to thank everybody for all their support who've joined in with the response from last year's review. And also just to say we feel that this would be a bit of a gateway condition if we can get the National Screening Committee to approve it, which would then open the doors for other leukodystrophies which have similar phenotype problems and treat some phenotypes which aren't treatable. So it's a really, really important piece of work, and one that I know myself and Karen are incredibly passionate about. So do look out for our emails about joining in with the psychosocial impact studies. The National Screening Committee do like a published study, so we do need to make sure that we can get as much evidence to them that is published and proper, and that they will consider very, very reasonably. I think another area is that they did not really appreciate the value of diagnosing Addison's early, and so that is also going to be quite a primary focus of our next review submission document. So I'm going to hand back over to Karen now, and we're going to have some more Q&As, and thank you for listening.